There is a moment many men recognize, even if they've never named it. A birthday approaches, and instead of anticipation, there is a quiet tightening. Not dread exactly, more like a preference forming in the body. Fewer messages, no plans, maybe a meal alone, or a normal workday that passes without comment. From the outside, it looks simple, low-key, mature, unbothered. But birthdays are not just dates. They are symbolic mirrors. They reflect how visible we feel in the world, how safe it is to be seen, and what we expect to receive when attention turns toward us. For many men, something has shifted over the years. What was once a public ritual, even a small one, has gradually become private, muted, or deliberately minimized. The question isn't what changed on the calendar. The question is what changed inside. If this resonates, it's important to slow down and remove judgment right away. Choosing a quiet birthday can feel like relief. Fewer expectations, less pressure to perform gratitude or joy, no risk of awkward gestures or missed expectations. And yet, alongside that relief, there is often something harder to name. A faint sense of loss, not dramatic, just a subtle awareness that something meaningful has been stepped away from, without quite knowing why. Culturally, we're surrounded by extremes, loud celebration on one side, complete indifference on the other. And minimalism, especially emotional minimalism, often gets framed as maturity, as self-possession, as proof that you're no longer dependent on external validation. In some cases, that's true. In others, minimalism becomes a signal, not just to others, but to the self. A way of saying, this is how much space I take up now. This is how visible I allow myself to be. Underneath all of this is an unspoken stake that rarely gets named. This isn't really about age, or cake, or parties.
It's about visibility, worth, and control. Visibility asks the question, if I'm seen, what happens next? Worth asks, am I celebrated because I matter, or tolerated because I'm convenient? And control asks, can I manage the risk of disappointment by lowering the volume before anyone else does? Many men learn over time that shrinking the moment feels safer than hoping for something that might not arrive. If you don't expect much, you can't be let down.
If you don't invite attention, you can't be misread. If you keep things quiet, you stay in control of the story. This logic makes sense. It's intelligent. It often forms in response to real experiences, not imagined ones. But there is an emotional paradox here. What begins as a way to protect yourself can quietly become a way to disappear from moments that once mattered. The body may feel calmer, but something else goes offline with it. A sense of being marked, remembered, witnessed as having endured another year. In Jungian terms, birthdays sit at the intersection of the persona and the deeper self. The persona manages how we're seen. The deeper self tracks whether being seen is safe. When those two fall out of alignment, rituals lose their meaning or become threatening. Not because they are shallow, but because they touch something vulnerable. So the real question isn't whether low-key birthdays are good or bad. The question is more precise and more honest. What does a muted birthday protect, and what does it cost? As we move forward, we'll look at this from several angles. Early experiences of attention, the nervous system's relationship with reward and disappointment, and the subtle ways avoidance can reshape relationships over time. None of this is about forcing celebration or prescribing a right way to mark a year. It's about restoring choice rather than defaulting to defense. If you stay with me, at the midpoint of this conversation we'll expose a pattern many men miss. A pattern where low-key stops being a preference and quietly becomes emotional armor. Seeing that pattern clearly doesn't require change. It only requires honesty. And honesty, when it's grounded and compassionate, has a way of giving choice back to the body. For some men, the discomfort around birthdays isn't about disliking attention in general. It's about what attention has meant before. The body remembers patterns long before the mind organizes them into explanations. When attention once arrived paired with criticism, withdrawal, or unpredictable responses, being seen stopped feeling neutral. It started to feel risky. This often traces back to early invalidation. Not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was subtle. A parent who showed up physically but not emotionally. Praise that came with conditions. Affection that disappeared when performance slipped. In those environments, attention didn't mean safety. It meant evaluation, exposure, a moment where something could go wrong. So when a birthday comes around later in life, the nervous system doesn't register it as a harmless ritual. It registers it as a spotlight. And under that spotlight, an old question quietly returns. What will happen if I'm fully seen here? Carl Jung used the word shadow to describe parts of us that were once necessary to hide. Not because they were bad, but because the environment didn't know how to receive them. Needs for recognition, appreciation, warmth, or celebration often get pushed into that shadow when expressing them leads to disappointment. Over time, those needs don't disappear, they go underground. One of the most common ways this shows up is through dismissal. I don't care about birthdays. It's just another day. I don't need all that. On the surface, this sounds like detachment. But psychologically, it's often a projection. A way of disowning a need by pretending it never existed. The shadow doesn't say, I want to be celebrated. It says, I'm above that. And that move feels safer. There is a counterintuitive truth here that can be difficult to sit with. Avoiding celebration isn't always humility. Sometimes it's preemptive self-erasure, a way of stepping out of the frame before disappointment has a chance to arrive. If no one shows up, it's because you didn't ask. If nothing special happens, it's because you didn't want it. Control is preserved. Vulnerability is avoided. Many men recognize this pattern not through thoughts, but through sensations. A tightness when someone suggests planning something, an urge to downplay milestones, a reflex to redirect attention back to others. These reactions don't come from nowhere. They are signals, not of weakness, but of a system that learned to regulate threat by staying small. From the outside, this can look like strong self-control, independence, emotional discipline. And to be clear, there are forms of simplicity that are genuinely chosen. But there is a difference between choice and conditioning. One expands the body, the other constricts it. What's regulating this avoidance is rarely conscious. It's not a decision like, I don't deserve attention. It's more implicit. A background rule that says, attention equals risk. Better to keep things predictable. Better to manage expectations. Better to remain unremarkable than to hope and feel the drop. Clinicians who work with attachment patterns hear this often, even when the topic isn't birthdays at all. Moments of focus, praise, or celebration trigger unease rather than pleasure. Online, men describe a sense of birthday dread without understanding why. They report feeling relieved when the day passes quietly, and vaguely unsettled that it did. This is where it helps to slow the narrative down. Not to fix anything, but to see it clearly, because avoidance often feels like control, until you look closely at what that control is protecting. Is it strength, or is it an old wound being carefully managed? When attention once came with strings attached, the safest strategy was to minimize the moment. That strategy may have worked then. The question worth holding now is whether it's still serving you, or simply repeating itself out of habit. Not to judge the habit, just to understand it. As we continue, we'll look at how this pattern often disguises itself as maturity, and how emotional restraint can quietly turn into emotional numbness. For now, it's enough to notice this. If being seen feels threatening, it didn't start with the birthday. The birthday just reveals it. There is a particular image of maturity many men inherit without ever consciously choosing it. The man who is calm, contained, and untouched by the need for recognition. The man who doesn't make a fuss, doesn't ask for much, and appears emotionally neutral in moments that once carried weight. This image is often praised. It looks like strength. It looks like discipline. It looks like growth. But images can mislead when they aren't examined. Emotional restraint on its own is not a problem. In fact, the capacity to pause, to regulate impulses, and to stay grounded under pressure is a real form of strength. The confusion begins when restraint quietly replaces aliveness. When being unbothered becomes less about choice and more about control. For many men, this control develops alongside perfectionism. The inner rule sounds reasonable. Don't need too much. Don't react too much. Don't depend on others for emotional nourishment. Over time, discipline gets reframed as identity. The man becomes someone who simply doesn't require celebration, or so the story goes. On a biological level, something else is often happening at the same time. Chronic stress, especially stress rooted in emotional vigilance, keeps cortisol levels elevated. When the nervous system stays in that state long enough, the brain adapts. Reward circuits become dampened. Anticipation feels risky. Pleasure starts to register as suspicious rather than nourishing. Joy doesn't disappear. It becomes harder to access. In this context, saying, "I don't care about birthdays," isn't indifference. It's regulation. The system has learned that lowering expectations reduces the chance of emotional spikes, both positive and negative. Flatness feels safer than fluctuation. Predictability feels safer than hope. This is where the reversal becomes important to name. The man who claims not to need celebration often isn't free from it. He's protecting narrative control. If nothing is expected, nothing can be lost. If the story is already written as just another day, then no one else gets to shape it, especially not in ways that might disappoint. Culturally, this pattern gets reinforced by simplified readings of Stoicism. The idea that strength equals emotional neutrality, that needing less automatically means being more evolved. But historically, Stoic traditions were not about erasing ritual or honor. In Roman culture, ceremonies of remembrance, transition, and acknowledgement were taken seriously. They weren't indulgences, they were containers for meaning. When those traditions get flattened into don't feel, don't need, don't react, something essential gets lost. The ability to receive without losing oneself. The ability to be witnessed without collapsing into dependence. There is a quiet tension here that many men live with. On the surface, life feels orderly. Internally, there is a subtle narrowing. Fewer peaks, fewer valleys, less risk, less disappointment, but also less vitality. Less sense of being marked by time and relationship. This isn't a failure of character. It's an adaptation that once made sense, especially for men who learned early that emotional expression led to chaos, criticism, or withdrawal. Control became the substitute for safety. 2 topics from now, we'll test this frame against a lived story that challenges the idea that avoidance equals wisdom. For now, it's enough to hold this distinction gently. Maturity is not the absence of need. It's the capacity to choose how, when, and with whom needs are met. When restraint hardens into identity, it stops serving growth. It simply maintains equilibrium. And equilibrium, while stable, is not the same as being fully alive. The question worth carrying forward is not whether celebration is necessary. It's whether the refusal of it is coming from grounded sovereignty, or from a system that learned long ago that wanting more was dangerous. Up to this point, we've been speaking mostly in the language of meaning, identity, control, adaptation. But here, at the midpoint, the conversation needs to drop out of theory and into the body. Because long before a man decides he prefers a low-key birthday, his nervous system has already made that decision for him. The body remembers what the mind explains later. For men who experienced repeated letdowns around moments of recognition, the memory is not stored as a clear story. It's stored as sensation, a tightening in the chest when anticipation builds, a flattening when expectations rise, a quiet dread that appears without words. Birthdays become triggers, not because of what they are, but because of what they reliably reactivate. Trauma memory is not about dramatic events alone. It's about repeated emotional patterns that the body learned to predict. Missed calls, forgotten dates, half-hearted gestures, promises that arrived late or not at all. Over time, the nervous system begins to associate anticipation with pain, not consciously, automatically. Neuroscience gives us a useful lens here through what's called dopamine prediction error. Dopamine is often misunderstood as the chemical of pleasure. In reality, it's the chemical of expectation. It rises when the brain predicts a reward. When that reward fails to arrive, or arrives inconsistently, the system recalibrates. It lowers expectations to reduce pain. This is not pessimism. It's risk management. If past rewards didn't materialize, the brain learns to expect less. Not as a belief, but as a strategy. This is why some men feel genuine relief when nothing happens on their birthday. The system has already negotiated the outcome. No spike, no drop, just equilibrium. Seen through this lens, low-key stops looking like preference. It starts looking like neural intelligence. The body has learned that hope is expensive, so it budgets carefully. There are stories like this shared quietly in forums across cultures. Men who recall childhood birthdays marked by absence, or early adult years where partners promised something special and delivered something hollow. Over time, the pattern teaches the body a rule. Anticipation leads to rupture. Better to disengage early. One man described it as stepping off the track before the train arrives, not because the train is guaranteed to crash, but because enough trains have already done so. Eventually, avoidance feels like wisdom. This is where the midpoint reveal lands. The pattern many men miss is this. What looks like emotional minimalism is often a trauma-informed nervous system lowering the ceiling on joy to avoid the floor of disappointment. The armor isn't cognitive, it's biological. And armor, once it works, tends to stay on. The cost of this strategy isn't always obvious. The body stays regulated. Life feels manageable, but something subtle shifts in relationships. If the body expects disappointment, it begins to scan for it everywhere, not consciously, but implicitly. This is where intimacy can start to feel like the next battleground. Not because others are dangerous, but because expectation itself has become associated with pain. It's important to say this clearly and without judgment. There is nothing weak about this response. It is what adaptation looks like in real time. Especially for men who learn to survive emotionally by staying contained, predictable, and self-sufficient. At the same time, adaptation is not the same as destiny. Patterns that once protected can later constrain, not by force, but by repetition. The body doesn't ask whether circumstances have changed. It simply repeats what worked. Understanding this doesn't require fixing anything. It only asks for recognition. When the body is understood, it no longer has to work so hard to protect itself. Awareness itself becomes regulating. From here, the conversation naturally turns outward. Because when one man quietly lowers his expectations, the relational field adjusts around him. And often, without anyone intending it, something else begins to disappear. When a man repeatedly signals that his birthday doesn't matter, something subtle happens in the relational field around him. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, others begin to adjust. They take their cues from what he presents, and what he presents often isn't indifference, but distance. Human relationships are shaped less by words than by patterns. When someone says, "Don't make a fuss," it can sound generous, undemanding, easy to be around. But beneath that message, another lesson is being taught. Investment is unnecessary here. Care should be minimal. Attention might be intrusive rather than welcome. Over time, this becomes a form of codependent signaling, not in the stereotypical sense of clinging or overgiving, but in its quieter counterpart, withdrawing in order to manage closeness. The unspoken hope is that others will insist, that they will push past the boundary and prove their care without being asked. But most people don't work that way. They respect what they're told, especially when it's repeated. So partners hesitate. Friends pull back. They become unsure how to show care without crossing an invisible line. What began as a strategy to avoid disappointment slowly trains others not to initiate at all. This is where the pattern deepens. For men with early attachment wounds, withdrawal can become a test of loyalty, not consciously. There is rarely a thought like, "Let's see if they'll show up anyway." Instead, the test lives in the body. If they care, they'll know. If they don't, at least I didn't expose myself by asking. This dynamic closely resembles trauma bonds, where closeness and distance are used to regulate safety. Pulling away creates tension. Tension invites pursuit, or it confirms a familiar belief when pursuit doesn't come. Either outcome reinforces the original wound. What feels like independence in this context is often rehearsed abandonment. Not because anyone wants to be abandoned, but because the nervous system recognizes the pattern. It knows how to survive it. Predictable pain feels safer than uncertain hope. The signals are usually relational rather than internal. A partner grows tentative around emotional moments. Friends stop initiating plans. Invitations become rarer, not out of malice, but out of confusion. The man tells himself he prefers it this way, while quietly noticing that fewer people step forward. This isn't about others failing to care enough. It's about an internal contract that was written long ago, often in an environment where asking for attention felt dangerous or pointless. The contract says, "I will not ask, and you will not give." This way, no one risks rejection. No one risks exposure. Community discussions around this pattern often reveal the same quiet grief. Men describe feeling unseen while simultaneously pushing visibility away. They speak of wanting depth and consistency while presenting emotional minimalism as their norm. The contradiction isn't hypocrisy, it's adaptation. Seeing this pattern clearly doesn't require blame. It requires compassion for the intelligence behind it. The system found a way to survive relational unpredictability, but survival strategies, when left unexamined, can quietly limit connection. At this point in the conversation, something important has emerged. Low-key birthdays are no longer just about the individual. They shape the ecosystem around him. They teach others how much presence is allowed, and presence, once reduced, doesn't automatically return on its own. From here, the lens needs to widen again, because this pattern isn't new, and it isn't personal. It has appeared in philosophy, in archetypes, and in long-standing debates about power, withdrawal, and visibility. That broader view offers language that can hold this experience without reducing it to pathology or preference. Long before birthdays became personal milestones, thinkers were already wrestling with a deeper question. What does it mean to step away from the world? And when does withdrawal become loss rather than wisdom? Philosophy gives us language for this tension, not to elevate it, but to see its shape more clearly. One useful lens here is archetypal rather than personal. The ascetic and the sovereign represent two different relationships to visibility. The ascetic turns away from the world to preserve inner purity, control, or peace. The sovereign remains visible, not for applause, but to anchor meaning, order, and continuity. Neither archetype is inherently superior. The cost appears when one is mistaken for the other. Many men who minimize their birthdays are unconsciously aligning with the ascetic, not in a spiritual sense, but in a psychological one. Withdrawal becomes framed as virtue. Needing less becomes evidence of depth. Detachment becomes a moral stance rather than a response to pain. Friedrich Nietzsche warned against this exact move. He criticized what he called life denial, masquerading as virtue. The refusal of pleasure, recognition, or vitality wasn't, in his view, proof of strength. It was often a reaction against disappointment that had never been metabolized. A turning away that looked noble on the surface, but quietly narrowed life underneath. Arthur Schopenhauer embodied this withdrawal in a more literal sense. He retreated from social engagement, convinced that desire itself was the source of suffering. There is clarity in his pessimism, but also a cost. Isolation became both protection and prison. Meaning was preserved, but vitality thinned. Contrast this with Niccolò Machiavelli, who understood visibility as strategic rather than indulgent. Power for him was not about constant noise or approval. It was about being seen at the right moments, in the right way, to stabilize one's position in the world. Disappearance was not humility, it was vulnerability. These figures aren't prescriptions. They are mirrors. They show how withdrawal can preserve dignity in some contexts and erode influence in others. They remind us that refusing the party isn't always about simplicity. Sometimes it's about avoiding the risk that comes with being marked, acknowledged, or remembered. Power, in this sense, isn't noise. It doesn't require performance or excess, but neither is it disappearance. When a man consistently removes himself from moments of recognition, he may protect his nervous system in the short term, while quietly surrendering his place in the shared narrative of his life. This isn't about reclaiming celebration as spectacle. It's about reclaiming meaning where avoidance once stood in for choice. Philosophical withdrawal, when it's conscious, serves clarity. When it's reactive, it quietly repeats the very suffering it claims to transcend. To move forward from this pattern, something subtle has to shift. Not outward behavior yet, but orientation. Meaning has to replace avoidance as the organizing principle. Without that shift, simplicity remains reactive. With it, simplicity becomes chosen. There is a subtle but profound difference between avoiding something and choosing something. On the surface, the behaviors can look identical. A quiet birthday, no announcement, no gathering, no expectation. But internally, the experience is entirely different. Avoidance is tight. Chosen simplicity is spacious. When a pattern has been driven by protection for long enough, it often carries a reactive quality. The body braces slightly. The mind stays alert. Even calm has an edge to it. In contrast, when simplicity is chosen rather than defaulted to, the nervous system softens. There is less vigilance, less need to manage outcomes. This is the pivot many men feel but struggle to articulate. It's not about adding celebration back in, and it's not about continuing to avoid it. It's about moving from reactive minimalism to intentional ritual, from doing less because it's safer, to doing what fits because it's aligned. Psychologically, this shift maps closely to what self-determination theory describes as autonomy without isolation. Autonomy is often misunderstood as self-sufficiency, but in reality, autonomy is about authorship, the sense that one's actions emerge from internal consent rather than external pressure or internal fear. In this frame, a birthday no longer has to carry the weight of social performance. It doesn't have to prove anything. It becomes a marker rather than a spectacle, a quiet acknowledgement rather than an event that invites judgment or disappointment. Some men discover that what they actually want is not a party, but a private signal of continuity, a way of marking time that doesn't depend on others getting it right, a moment that says, "This year mattered," even if no one else witnessed it. When this kind of marker is chosen freely, it doesn't close the door to connection. It stabilizes it. There is a counterintuitive gain here. When boundaries are grounded rather than defensive, they allow selective visibility. Instead of shutting the world out, they clarify where and how contact is welcome. Visibility becomes something that can be modulated, not eliminated. This shift doesn't arrive through force or resolution. It arrives through orientation. The internal stance changes from "this is safer" to "this is mine." And ownership carries a different quality than avoidance. It doesn't need to explain itself. It doesn't need to justify its quiet. At this point in the arc, something important has happened. The conversation is no longer about birthdays at all. It's about authorship, about the difference between living in reaction to past disappointments and living from present choice. There is no closure yet, only momentum. Because once avoidance loosens its grip, the question is no longer whether to be seen or not. The question becomes how visibility can exist without cost to the self. And that question leads naturally to integration, not correction. When we step back and look at the full arc, low-key birthdays begin to read less like a lifestyle choice and more like a signal. Not a flaw, not a failure, a signal. Like a smoke alarm that doesn't mean the house is burning, but does mean something in the environment deserves attention. For many men, quiet birthdays are the nervous system's way of saying, something here feels unsafe to hope for. That message matters. It points to intelligence, not deficiency. The problem only arises when the alarm keeps ringing long after the danger has passed, slowly convincing the system that silence is the only stable option. What changes things is not volume, but choice. There is a difference between control rooted in fear and sovereignty rooted in grounding. Fear-based control tightens life down to what can be managed. Grounded sovereignty allows presence without surrendering the self. One contracts, the other steadies. Seen this way, reclaiming choice doesn't mean becoming visible everywhere. It means visibility is no longer avoided by default. It becomes something that can be entered deliberately, on terms that respect both the body's history and the self's values. This is where the meaning of the ritual shifts. Not back to performance, not back to expectation, but toward ownership. A moment marked because it matters to you, not because it needs to be witnessed by everyone. And paradoxically, when visibility is chosen rather than defended against, it often becomes less threatening and more precise. There is an image that captures this well. A lighthouse doesn't shout. It doesn't chase ships or demand attention, but it also doesn't turn itself off. Its presence is steady, contained, and unmistakable. It exists not to impress, but to orient. That kind of visibility doesn't exhaust the system. It stabilizes it. In this light, the question resolves itself. Blowing out candles alone isn't wrong. Neither is sharing the flame. What matters is whether the choice is coming from grounded clarity or from an old need to stay unseen. Invisibility defended may feel safe, but it slowly erodes authorship. Visibility chosen, even in small, quiet ways, restores it. And authorship is what allows a life to feel lived from the inside rather than managed from the edges. If any part of this conversation mapped your experience, one signal is enough. One line, shared quietly, not as explanation, but as recognition. It has a way of letting others know they are not alone in seeing what you just saw.